Good day, everybody. Welcome to Adroit online webinar, how to configure security in a Maps or and Smart UI server. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining today. Just a quick note about last week. For those of you that tried to join and weren't able to, unfortunately our ISP, our internet service provider, went down on Friday last week, and out of our hands, unfortunately, we weren't able to run the webinar. And I'd just like to thank everybody for understanding. For those of you that didn't understand, well, again, our heartfelt apologies. I'd just like to lay down a few rules here. Gentlemen, you'll notice that you have a questions as well as a chat area. Please reserve the questions area for any legitimate questions. These will either be answered during the webinar, or I will attempt to respond to them directly via email. Alright, so let's get this show on the road. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dean Gibson. I'm the International Commercial and Technical Support Engineer for Adroit Technologies. My contact info on the screen is deang@adroit.co.za. You can also contact our support department at support@adroit.co.za. To get started, the first thing we're going to be looking at is how to create users and add them to a project. We'll then be breaking up security into two sections: server-side security and graphic form security, which we will cover in the appropriate sections. Alright, so for those of you that are unaware of it, Maps and Smart UI security is a user-centric which operates on top of the traditional Windows operating system, using a configurable subset of existing users and groups on each server computers known as the allowed users and groups. Basically what this means is if we open up our security console, our computer management console, I'm going to be using my local security. We are, however, compatible with domain security as well, but for the purpose of this exercise, I'll be using local. So typically what I'll do is when creating security, I'll first come along and create my users. Inside here, you'll see that we've got a number of users available that I've pre-created for us, as well as a default operator. There's my username and my username. The user that you install Maps or Smart UI under will automatically have this user added to all of it. Will have access to everything within the server, so you don't need to expose your current user that you've installed the software under. But if you want a operator, for example, I've created two here, operator 1 and operator 2, and we're going to be using those as our logins. Now, when designing my security system, I will typically first create a security model, which I will base on a matrix, what I would typically refer to a matrix, which I'm going to just pull up quickly here. Unfortunately, it looks like I've misplaced my matrix, but we'll quickly look for it under one of my projects here, which I'll pull up. Excuse me guys, I seem to have misplaced my document, much to my annoyance. I'll have a look under our maps here. I'm sure I've got my document in here. Hopefully, Word, not under there. Alright. Okay, well, sorry that I can't show you my matrix, but typically I will create a as I said, a matrix where I will define what the users can access and what they cannot. This allows me to design and configure and have an idea of where I'm going with my security. I see I have a question. Ben, if you go ahead and ask your question. Alright, well, I'll just bring that down. Alright, gentlemen, so once I've created my users, I'm then going to go along and add my users to a group. Now, personally, I prefer working with groups instead of users. The reason I assign security to groups is that when I create or when I have a new user joining my operation or my process, I don't want to have to go and reassign that new user through my entire project. I just want to be able to add that user into my group, as you see that I've done with my two operators here. So once I've created my groups and I've created my structures within my agent server environment, we can then operating system, we can then minimize that, and we can now bring up our designer. So you'll see inside your designer the place that we assign security. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Maps or Smart UI design environment, is in something that we refer to as our enterprise manager. The enterprise manager is broken up into three areas: data sources, management, and projects. We're interested in the management portion of our enterprise manager. Within there, we have three subsections: profile, security, and systems. We're going to be looking at security. So normally, the Maps or Smart UI product works on a normally closed security model, meaning that you have to open up the different, you have to first expose the user to the Maps server. Once we've exposed the user, we then have to add that user to the required data sources and projects so that the users can then access them. So as you see, we have two subgroups of our users and groups. Obviously this is our groups. Within groups, we'll have all the groups that are available to us, and under allowed groups, we then have our currently exposed users. So I'm going to go along and I'm going to set my allowed user here, and of course nothing ever runs smoothly, so I'm currently still looking at my domain security here, so I'm quickly going to change that over to my local security. I'm just going to click on the finish button. I'm going to close my server quickly. I'm then going to go along and open up my config, Maps config or Smart UI config editor. While my editor is busy opening up, you'll notice that on the screen I've got a little error. Business has called a program a plugin error. For more information, click details. Basically, the Quest server does not exist anymore. That's because I've shut it down. So I can just close that and it'll repopulate when I start my server up again. Alright, setting up my server. Just going to go in here. I'm just going to go and change my security settings. Inside here, you'll notice that I'm still pointed at my corporate domain. I'm just going to go and remove that. Hit the refresh button. This will now go and retrieve all the users and groups from my local security. There it is. There's all the users that I've created in my local machine. And here's all my available users that I have created. There's my engineers, there's my managers, and there's my operators. I'm going to go along, I'm going to click finish. I'm going to restart my server. Once the server has started up. Just wait for my enterprise manager to refresh. I've got quite a number of data sources available on this particular server here, and as well as projects, so it does take a few minutes for it to refresh and reinitialize. Again, under security, as I said before, I'll go to my users and groups, expose my users and groups, set my allowed users. I'm now going to scroll. I'm just going to add my operators, which I'll move across into my allowed users group, and I'll say finish. And I now have a new group in there. So once I've now exposed that user, which is all well and fine, I now need to tell those groups which projects and which data sources are available or allowed to work with that particular data source. So for example, in my case, I'm just going to go along and on my Adroit data source that I've created, right click on him, and I'm going to go to security. I'm going to move my operators group across into the selected group. I'm going to select that operators group, and I can now come along and specify what that user is able to do, or that group in this case is able to do. In our case, I want my operators to be able to configure, read, write, and remove data from my data source. If I go along and say apply to all children and click on the finish button, it will then go and apply right down to my data element level that user. I can also individually at each data element change how that group interacts with that particular data element. So for example, I don't want my operators to be able to change the value of this particular analog. So I'm going to come along here, and I'm going to say my operators group cannot write data to that particular agent slot or that data element, and I click finish. Once I've done that, I can then go along and apply my security to my other data elements as well. For example, under configure for my event log, oops, I don't want to configure that, sorry. We want to assign the security to it. Just move him across and apply to all children. Make sure that he's in there, and we can do it to my recipe database as well. And we can say that operator, but he is only allowed to read from that data source. He is not allowed to change any data or any values in there. So if we go to our security for our table, there you'll see the operator has been disabled from that table. Okay, once we've done that, I can then go along and expose a project. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call this project security example. Finish him up, just a blank project, and I'm just going to go along and create a graphic form in that new blank project. Once I've created that graphic form, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go along and I'm going to go and change, put a button down. I'm going to put a display value on that button, which I'll just display the value of that sample, of my sample analog. And I'm also going to go and just put an operator action, or rather, now let's just put an operator action on there. And we'll browse for the same analog.value, and we'll make it a data entry. Once we've done that, we can click finish, save it, and now if I open up my operator, I'm going to go along and log into my operator just as with my username. We're going to go and open up our security, open up the graphic form, and we can go along and change this value. Finish. There he goes, and he gets changed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and log in as my operator. Operator 1, give him his password, and once we log in, notice, gentlemen, that there are no projects currently available. That is because this user does not have rights to any of the projects. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to give our user rights to that project, and we do this by selecting the project, going to security, and moving my operator across. The operator, he wants to have full rights to all of the graphic forms, and I want him to apply to all my children, or sub graphic forms within that project. And I say finish. I save my server data now. Open up my operator, and refresh it, and there is my graphic form, and there is my value. Now if I come along and I try and attempt to change this value, I will now be given an elevated rights, because remember, as configured in that particular data element, that value data element, we have specified that anybody belonging to that operator group does not have rights to that data. So I'm going to come along, my operator informs me and says, listen, I need to change my set point. I come along, add my user to it, supply my credentials. I can also supply a comment, and we can click on the finish button, and there my value changes. So the security that we've currently implemented now is what we refer to as server-side security. The reason we talk about server-side security is because this security is assigned at the server level within my enterprise manager. One of the other security functions we can do at the server side is also assigning a profile, or configuring my profile. The profile typically tells our operator what must happen when a specific user logs in. So by default, or we have a profile called, strangely enough, default, which we can open up. And inside here, it tells us the profile properties. That is the first page that opens up. And you'll notice that down at the bottom, we have the different groups and users that have been exposed to our system, and which ones are assigned to this particular profile. In our case, all of us, all our users have been assigned to this profile. I also have a few settings that I've changed for myself. For example, I like to work with Microsoft C#, and my script editor I use is Microsoft Visual Studio .NET 2010. My user logs off after a predefined period, and I haven't reverted that user back. What we can also do is our operator settings. I want to tell this operator that he can load a default graphic. But now, instead of configuring this one, what I want to do is I want to create a different profile for my operator. What I do is instead of having to reconfigure one from scratch, I can right click on my profile, my default profile, and I can say create new profile based on this default one. In the top, it's going to prompt me for a name. I'm going to specify operators. Oops, we can give it a proper name. I can specify a specific language for that user, which script language we want to use. In this case, our operators aren't really going to be scripting, so we'll just leave it as default. However, I will be changing the script editor to our built-in one. We can also specify after how many seconds of inactivity. So let's say 60 seconds. That'll give the operators a minute before of inactivity on their screen before logging off. And I'm going to select the operators group. The next thing I'm going to do is in my operators, I'm going to specify the default graphic form path. In this case, I'll just minimize where I was last working, specify the graphic form, and I say finish. We can also specify whether we want our operator to run full screen or not. I'm going to leave mine false, but I'm going to turn off my operators mode within my operator itself. Once I've done that, I can click finish, save my server data, and now I'm going to go along and I'm going to log off, and I'm going to log on. Let's use operator 2 this time. Punch in his password. And before I log in, we're just going to say finish. And there my operator has opened up. Toggle operator mode is off by default. We can turn it back on again. Turn it off. And again, I then have, if I attempt to change it under this particular operator, it will deny me that without an elevated user or a single user login. Alright, so that's pretty much security in the server in a nutshell. There are a few other advanced security features which we will be covering in future webinars. We are currently under development with a bulk security tool using a Excel spreadsheet plugin which will allow you to bulk configure your security on the server side. This we are hoping to release early next year, so keep an eye out for that one. Alright, the next thing I want to look at within my security environment is something that we refer to as graphic form security. So graphic form security is where we assign security at the physical graphic form layer or on the graphic form itself. Now, the security comes in two flavors. The first one is our behavior security. So what I'm going to do is, within my Adroit environment, within my data source, I'm just going to go along and from my analog, I'm going to go and change that server-side security, and I'm going to say operators are now able to write out data. Save our server data. And I would now rather assign my security at a behavior level. And the way I do this is I open up my operator action behavior. I come along to my advanced view, and we'll see down here that we have a security data element input area. What I'm going to go and do is now assign my security. In this case, I want merely my administrators group, so my operators are not allowed to click on that button. Click finish, and we click finish, and I can now save this. Now if we go to our operator itself, I'm just quickly going to log in. And when I attempt to click on that object, no input jumps up, we are not allowed to input any security onto that data element. I physically have to log off and log in with my username. Oopsie, things are a little bit slow here today. And we then go along and open up our security example. I can now go and change my set point. Alright, so that's the one example of graphic form security. The next one is assigning a security to an object that has no behavior on it. So in this case, I'm going to go along and I'm going to place another button on the screen. And this button will have, for those of you that are unaware, I will go along and I'm going to go, when I click on that button within my Spider workspace area, for example, I want it to drive a digital value. So I'm going to create a constant spider. And I want that constant spider to be triggered by an event. That event will be our button 1. Click. And it will take the true value and it will drive it straight into our digital. Now, because I don't have a behavior on this object, I cannot stop the operator from clicking on this button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expose this to my security on my form itself, or my security on the graphic form. The way I do this, it's an advanced property of the button. There's our security on form. We drop it down and we say true. What this does now is it exposes that object to our security collection on the form. So just if I'm going a little bit too fast here, let me just do that again. I have to first, on the button, expose that object to my security by enabling the security on form for that particular object. Then selecting the graphic form, I go to the security collection. And you'll notice that I now have in my components button 1. And what I can do now is I can say, for my operators, I wish this button, and I can change any one of his properties. In this case, I'm going to say, I want him to be enabled false. And we save our graphic form. So I can now open up our digital, set it to false, and because I'm logged in as an administrator, I can set that button to true. However, if I log off and change my username, we're going to assign this password to this guy, put him in, click finish. You'll now notice that object is grayed out. Okay, so we can change any property depending on what the user, which user logs in. I can define this either as invisible even, or I can change its color, or change its text, or any property on there, assign it to a specific user itself. And that pretty much brings us to the end of our presentation, my presentation on security. Gentlemen, if you have any questions, or if you would like to make a statement, or if you any comments, please feel free to do it now. I'm going to unmute all your mics. But yeah, thank you very much for all of your participation.